Since the first video did so well and y'all responded so well to it, I thought, well, I might as well make a part 2 of filmmaking lies you've been told and the solutions. Now I think a great place to start for this part 2 is gear. And I know we've all heard the talk on YouTube about gear matters and gear doesn't matter, but the truth is nobody's talking about why it does or doesn't matter because neither side is necessarily wrong. Gear should only be as good as you are. So if you're operating in Arri Alexa Mini LF with master primes as a beginner, you have no clue what you're doing. You're not gonna produce a better image with that camera and that lens than you would with a basic starter camera because you don't know what to do with that gear. And that's incredibly important. Moving on from necessarily that side of things over to what YouTubers tend to tell you is they're not well-versed enough in gear to really tell you these things. I did 3 years in film school. 2 years were in a cohort where pretty much 24/7 I was shooting some kind of project, one or another. We had access to Red cameras, Arri Master Primes. I've shot on rigs that cost upwards of $100,000, and I've used mechanics to move that gear that costs upwards of $300,000 and even more. I've used the really nice, expensive Hollywood gear. I've also used the really cheap, crappy, buy it off eBay gear. So I can tell you accurately, the YouTuber who has really, really nice gear and is maybe just mediocre at their craft is gonna tell you that gear doesn't matter because it doesn't matter to them because they have nicer gear, better gear than they are skillful. Now, other people who would tell you that gear absolutely matters are people who have not as good gear as they are. The gear doesn't quite match up to their skill level. They're more skilled than the gear that they have. And that can be an issue in filmmaking because this stuff is really, really expensive. If you want any kind of minor upgrade, it could cost you hundreds of dollars. So it is very tricky, but that's kind of where the gear does or doesn't matter argument comes to a head. It's how good are you? And at some point, you just got to start making money doing things that you might not necessarily want to do in filmmaking or not doing filmmaking at all in order to get the gear that really shines with your kind of skill level. And that's a journey. It's a journey that we're all on. We're all upgrading cameras, upgrading lenses, upgrading gear, but you should be upgrading that stuff with your skill level, not ahead of it, and hopefully not behind it. The next thing I want to talk about are filters. And yes, I know that sounds kind of boring, but stay with me here. It gets real interesting. First, inside of my Nisi filter pouch, I'll leave a link to this in the description. I'm not affiliated, I just really like it. Here we have a clear streak filter. Now, I used to use this thing on short films and random projects when I wanted things to look kind of anamorphic. I'd use the Helios 442 and this, and it produced, a really fake anamorphic image. It tricked a lot of older filmmakers, but younger filmmakers knew exactly what I was doing. It's a neat little gimmick, but it sometimes just looks really bad. And so I would say if you're a young filmmaker trying to get better, don't use these. There are lots of cheap anamorphic lenses that you can get that actually give you a more anamorphic look than a clear streak filter. It's something I'd say stay away from. However, it can be useful in a pinch, especially if that's what a client wants and you don't have anamorphic glass or they don't have budget for it. Now, the next thing I want to talk about in terms of filters is in my backpack, not in my filter case. And it is rectangular filters. These right here are from K&F Concept. Right here, I have 2 variations of hard stop ND. Now these are true color ND, so when you throw these in front of the camera, I'll pull it out so you can see it. You throw that in your matte box in front of the camera, you get no color shifting or very little. Now, I like the K&F Concept ones. I know a lot of people do. They come in these really nice pouches. I absolutely love them. But another thing I want to talk about, aside from using hard stop NDs, which by the way, if you're a filmmaker, use those instead of VNDs. It works so much better. You have less trouble in post. It's what you should be doing as a filmmaker, and that's what the industry does. Nobody uses VNDs in Hollywood, in case you were curious. Next is the infamous black ProMist filter. This is the ProMist filter from K&F Concept. Again, I really like their stuff a little bit better. The glass is a little bit cleaner, less reflections, better coating, all of that good stuff. This is a super controversial filter, and I like it, but for weddings only. I pretty much don't use this filter outside of shooting weddings. That's because people like this dreamy, memory-esque look for weddings most of the time. And I like to use this, and it seems to be very popular with Sony users. I find that Sony users use Black Pro Mist more than anybody else. I think that's just the social media look these days. But aside from that social media look in weddings, stay away from this filter. It's not gonna do you much good. You're much better to just haze a room than apply Black Pro Mist. It's kind of a gimmick. It's kind of becoming what clear streak filters were. It was cool when it came out, and now that it's been out for a bit, people are finding that using a lens that is naturally softer, like cinema glass, is a whole lot better. So let's talk about lenses. And yes, I know I've already talked about this before in the last video, but today I want to talk not about focal lengths, but about photo versus cinema glass, because there's huge misconceptions in this topic and they really need to be discussed. Now with photo glass, I think YouTubers a lot of the times associate it with autofocus glass. And yes, it does autofocus, and that's great if you need autofocus. I think there are a few scenarios where I think the average videographer can't really manual focus. I think sports for a lot of people is a struggle. I've been manual focusing for the better part of a decade at this point. So I use manual focus for sports, and my manual focus works better than most people's autofocus. And I get to use a plethora of lenses that otherwise I would not be able to use. And it allows me to afford better, cheaper glass, all because it doesn't have autofocus. And I think that's a huge advantage. But while affordability is a great advantage, I think the biggest advantage is how it looks. Cinema glass is not clinical. You see, when you're shooting video on photo glass, you're shooting it on photo glass. Photo glass is supposed to be sharp from corner to corner. Now, that's great for photos, and that's cool if that's the look you're going for, and I know a lot of people like that. But the same people that say, oh, they want Black Pro Mist filters in front of their lenses to soften the look, also want tack sharp lenses because things need to be sharp. It's a contradiction that doesn't really make sense, and it's a contradiction that I see a whole lot of YouTube cinematographers making, and it's a really bad one. Now, I think cinema glass really has the edge on the look. I think, when we talk about photo glass, we're like, oh, how fast is it? And how fast is the autofocus? And those are the only two things we talk about. When it comes to cinema glass, it's so much more nuanced. It's where do the colors shift? How do the edges of the frame bend? And where's the focus fall off? And where's it sharpest? And what aperture does it get sharp at? Where do the chromatic aberrations disappear? How can I use this to tell a story in the right way? Because people use different lenses to tell stories in different ways. You don't have the option with photo glass. Not to mention that if you're watching this video right now and you're thinking, oh, I really wanted that new lens that Nikon, Sony, or Canon just dropped, but it's way out of my price range, and I really just need an 85mm lens, look no further than cinema glass. You can get cheap, full frame cinema glass for right about $300. That's insane. And if you shoot Super 35, the Sirui Nightwalkers are an excellent option. They're fairly sharper on the cinema side of things, but they look a whole lot better than photo glass does. And I believe their aperture is T12, and they cost about $350 to $400 a piece. And I think I've seen sets go for about $780 on B&H. It's an absolute steal, and when you're getting 3 lenses for the price of one decently autofocusing lens, it's hard to really make the argument that photo glass is better when it doesn't look better, it doesn't have the same character, you can't control it in the same way, and it can be 3, 4, or 5 times as expensive as its cinema counterparts. Let's talk about rolling shutter, because it is way overhyped on YouTube and I have absolutely zero clue why. Rolling shutter is a type of shutter style. You have global and rolling. Now, when you have a bad readout speed or a slow readout speed on a rolling shutter sensor, sometimes when you pan really fast, straight objects will get a little wonky. Now, this isn't preferred. Obviously, we would rather have global shutter, but those cameras are usually expensive and come at the cost of some dynamic range, unless you're talking about the new Red V Raptor X, which is a totally different discussion for another video. However, I think the hype over rolling shutter issues is way overblown and incredibly out of proportion on YouTube, because people just want a subject to talk about. They don't know what they're actually talking about. I think every time a camera is released that has bad rolling shutter, specifically Lumix and Blackmagic, and I might be biased a little bit on this issue because I like Lumix and Blackmagic, they have poor readout speeds. They have a lot of rolling shutter and it's not great, But I find that most of the time, if you're on a long lens, by the way, I shoot baseball at 300mm focal lengths, and it's fine because the background is blurred out. So while I might have fence posts in the back that normally would be skewed, because they're so out of focus, you can't tell. You're focused on the player. If people are focused on your background and not your subject, you did something horribly wrong as a cinematographer, and your rolling shutter really doesn't matter at that point. I think the biggest complaint against it is probably if you're doing whip pans, and I can definitely see that being a complaint. There are ways to fix it in post for whip pans especially, so I still don't think it's that big of an issue. But honestly, how often are we doing whip pans? For a shot like this, any kind of general moving shot, it's not that big of a deal. I think you really run into it when you start shooting anamorphic. I've definitely noticed rolling shutter performance is not optimal when shooting on a 1.5x anamorphic like I am right now. However, it's not as bad as these YouTube filmmakers might lead you to believe. This is probably the most important and dangerous filmmaking lie of them all, and it is brand loyalty. I hate to say it, but the brand that you are loyal to has a negative impact on your filmmaking. Now, I consider myself a pretty non-loyal cinematographer. I will shoot with any camera you give me. If you want to shoot on an EOS M, no magic lantern, it's a 10-year-old mirrorless camera. It's Canon's first mirrorless camera. I'll shoot on it. I will shoot on whatever camera you want me to use to tell the story, and I'll choose whatever camera is best to tell the story. Whether that's Canon, Sony, Blackmagic, Lumix, Fuji, whatever it is, as long as the specs of that camera and the form factor of that camera work best for me, it's the camera that I will use. It's why I shoot on the Lumix S5. I don't have the budget for a RED right now, and hopefully I will soon. But as for right now, this camera serves me really, really well. It's a sub $1,000 full frame camera that has waveform, shutter angle, and it's had that for 5 years, by the way. So again, Sony fanboys who are really bragging about that right now, we've had it longer. There's always somebody else who's done the thing before you. I choose a camera based off of that. When I shoot on RED, I shoot on RED for very particular reasons. A lot of the times because their Super 35 cameras are usually like a 1.17 crop on the Dragon and a 1.28 crop on the Helium. It's a really interesting crop factor, which allows me to get some really interesting results with Super 35 lenses. It gives me a unique perspective. It gives me a unique look that I really, really like. And then I'll go and shoot something on a Canon that gives me a very different look. And I get it. We really like the brands that we're with because we're invested in their ecosystem. Once you get a bunch of RF glass, it's really expensive to switch, and I get that, and I'm not saying you should. But as a filmmaker, you need to have an open mind that when somebody shoots with another brand, they're shooting for a different reason than you are. And they're making films in a very different way, almost all the time. At the end of the day, results are what matters. Telling a story is what matters. And if you're a filmmaker who's upset at somebody else because of their brand choice, you pay more attention to the gear you use than to the films you're trying to make. And that will only hurt you.